Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us today. We're going to give folks a few minutes to log in, and while we do, we will just make some introductions. I am Brandi Horton. I have met some of you previously. I am the Vice President of Communications at Rails to Trails Conservancy. I am joined here today by my colleague Elle. Elle, do you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here with us today. We're looking forward to chatting.
Yeah, so we are going to have a robust conversation about the latest and greatest on federal policy, what's been happening here in DC, and most importantly, what everyone on the line can do about it. Let's go to the next slide, Elle. So some of you may have joined us earlier this year in April. Ryan Chow, RTC's president, Kevin Mills, RTC's vice president of policy, and myself did an update on what had really been happening in the arena of trails, walking, and biking since the Trump administration had taken office. There had been a series of executive orders and actions out of the administration that were having an effect on funding and causing some concerns about what might be coming up in the future. And so we were sharing just some context about where we were and what we were doing as an organization to really protect the mission in this moment. So today, we're now about 6 months into the administration. There's also been some major actions out of Congress. So there's even more excitement these days in Washington, D.C. than there was in April. So we'll do a little bit of talking through kind of just the general federal landscape, where we are right now, what we're looking at, and the strategy we're building and deploying to make sure that trails, walking, and biking remains an important federal priority and also an important priority for state and local governments as well. But then we want to kind of pivot the conversation a little bit to look at this group of really meaningful members and donors to our organization, but also influencers in your community, about how you can join forces with us and really kind of help to shape the narrative that's happening all around us and help have an impact as we look ahead to some pretty big legislative milestones that are coming up in the next 18 months. So with that, I'm going to pass it on over to Elle to take us through the federal policy landscape. What is happening these days?
Nothing. No, Brandi, thank you so much. It's great again to be with you all. So I'm going to talk a bit about what's happening at the administrative level. So with the White House, with the Secretary of Transportation, with the U.S. Department of Transportation, and then I'll dive a bit more into congressional actions that affect our movement. So on the administrative side, things are really fluid. This is a pretty uncertain moment, an uncertain policy environment. We're seeing an assertion of unprecedented executive control. And what that looks like is broad federal funding being frozen, which we'll talk a little bit about. But there are billions in funding that were awarded over the last several years that are frozen and under review right now. There are grant reviews that are taking place, policy changes, different alignments around principles, much of which happens in different administrative transitions. But really, there's also a revision around taking back unobligated funding, which we'll talk about as well. So a lot is happening on the administrative front that is affecting funding for trails, walking, and biking. So within that, the U.S. Department of Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy, there's been several directives that have been released that impact trails and active transportation. So the first piece of this was a real reset of principles and standards. What is the department going to emphasize? What priorities come forward when we're thinking about trails, walking, and biking? And this is throughout transportation, but these are a few of the pieces that impact our work most closely. So the first piece is an emphasis on projects not being the federal role. So believing that the role of building trails belongs to state and local governments. And obviously we've seen the importance, and we advocate so strongly for the importance of federal funding. Without federal funding, our movement would be in an entirely different place. In the last 30 years, we've seen the vast majority of funding come from the federal government. And so, but that is something that is being articulated, is that this is not the federal role. to be funding these types of projects. There's been an effort to amend existing grant agreements to align with the administration's priorities. And some of that takes the shape around some cultural issues that have been emphasized. There's been an articulation of prioritizing funding in places with high birth and marriage rates. There's been emphasis on not funding places that have mask mandates or vaccine mandates. And then there's been an emphasis on cooperation with immigration officials. Those, there's a lot to say about that and how communities have been responding there. But those were sort of new framings put forth by this administration. And then within that, there's some articulated values, some of which we see opportunities to emphasize the importance of trails. There's been a real emphasis looking at family and children's safety, which of course we all on this call know that separated trails that are separated from traffic provide the safest option for families and children to be able to walk and bike safely. And there's an epidemic of fatalities and injuries that impact bicyclists and pedestrians, including children across the country. Access to opportunities and economic development, that's a theme that we definitely heard in the first Trump administration. And we are really prepared to respond to that with a lot of great data on the impact of trails and evidence of the impact of trails in communities and how it supports jobs and tourism and all sorts of great things. And Brandi will touch on some of the messaging there. And then quality of life as well, which is hugely supported by trails. There was a rescission order put forth, which just kind of continuing on what the secretary directives have looked like for our movement. There was a rescission order which initiates action against grants, policies, or programs which are inconsistent with administrative policies. So that kind of hones in on some of the pieces that I put forth and highlighted under the principal as standard resets. And then getting kind of further into the last few months, and in March, specifically bicycle infrastructure was added to the list of topics subject to review. And recreational trails and shared used paths were also called out. So that was a deeply concerning memo. And within that, there's also an articulation of unobligated or unused funds or partially obligated or partially used funds can be canceled or the scope can be negotiated. So again, kind of going back to that last slide, there's a lot going on, a lot to parse out, but it's been a challenging environment and a lot for us to be responding to. And we have been doing a lot to respond. So I'll be touching on that right here. So we've been really focused on the clawbacks or sort of the grant reviews, different words, but same kind of piece here. We really want to see awarded funding move forward. There's been a lot of funding that has been awarded to trail projects across the country that are currently stuck in limbo and review. And so what we've been doing to push back and to have a strategy to respond is we've been deploying strategic leadership. So really highlighting the local impacts and violation of local control and local expectations. So, a lot of communities were planning for these funds, spent a lot of time applying for these funds, and to have the funding not necessarily, gone forever, but in indefinite review without updates has been challenging. And so leaning on local voices to speak to the impact of that lack of clarity, to speak to the impact of the need for this funding, and again, to speak to some of the themes that this administration is emphasizing, how trails meet those emphases and meet the themes that this administration is championing, like quality of life and children's and family safety. So one of the real success stories we had in activating some of these local leaders was we had a letter to Secretary Duffy a few months ago, which included 175 local leaders from, I believe, 35 states, signing to articulate the importance of funding for these local projects and the importance of supporting trails through federal funding. We also had a number of local chambers and local businesses sign on as well. So again, to have that access to opportunity and economic development angle. We've been doing a lot of webinars, partner updates. Some of you may have seen those. And we've also been engaging in direct advocacy. So we've been meeting with Congress. We've been meeting with the Department of Transportation. We met with political leadership there. And we've been really championing the need for funding to be released, funding to move forward. We've been trying to track down if there's been changes to grant agreements. And just really emphasizing the need for this funding forward-looking as well, which I'll touch on that in a moment. So that was a little bit about the administrative context. I want to switch over and talk a little bit about what's happening at Congress, right, or in Congress right now. So Congress is quite dynamic as well. There are multiple fronts that we are navigating right now. The biggest one that I would flag for all of us, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail in a moment about it, is reauthorization, which is the federal transportation legislation. This has been the main source of federal funding for trails, walking, and biking for the last 30 years. It has been transformative for our movement. And over the last several years, the bipartisan infrastructure law has provided unprecedented funding as well. And so we are looking ahead to the next bill, which the current legislation will expire in September of 2026. I'll talk a little bit more about timeline in a minute, but we are preparing both defense and offense, looking ahead to that, recognizing the significance of this legislation, focusing on improved dedicated trail walking and biking programs and grant funding. We're looking at emphasizing the importance of fostering innovation of mobility options and looking about accountability measures. So making sure that funding is really associated with goals and doesn't just kind of exist in a vague slush fund type thing that is not used as taxpayers intended it to be used. Appropriations. So where we have this big bill, we also have annual cycles where we're trying to secure funding for trails as well, the annual appropriation cycle. So in 2026, we had, or we are currently negotiating some of that work right now to secure funding for ATIP. So I'll talk about that in a minute. And then the rescission challenges. So you may have heard about a large bill called the One Big Beautiful Bill. I'll talk about that in a minute and its implications. You also may have heard the term rescissions, which is kind of clawing back of awarded funds. And that took place. There was a large rescission bill that Congress moved forward, particularly targeting PBS, NPR, and foreign aid programs, USAID. That did not impact active transportation. But the reason I flagged it here is that we've seen obviously openness for Congress to move forward with that. So we are on high alert that this could impact previously awarded funds as well. So I'm going to dive into all of this in more detail over the next few slides, but just an overview of the multiple fronts we're working on. The last thing that's not on the slide here is I'll mention some of you may be familiar with some attacks on rail banking, which is the federal law that enables us to do a lot of what we do. It helps us make abandoned railways into trails. And that has been under attack, and we are working really aggressively with partners to uplift the importance of keeping that. And so if folks have questions about that, happy to talk through that as well. So transportation reauthorization, again, that every 5 or 6 year bill that funds all the incredible things that we all care about. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, runs through 2026, through fall of 2026. But Congress has really expressed an interest in moving forward with new legislation before that expires. And we are working really diligently to emphasize the importance of dedicated funding to trails. But what we are seeing right now is committee members who are open and supportive of the idea of giving a lot of flexibility to states without accountability. So letting states decide what they use funding for and a deference to their authority, but without any accountability measures, without transparency of what that funding is going towards. And that creates a real fear that this funding will not be used for trails, that it'll be used for other projects as it has been historically. And so even though there's outsized demand and continued robust demand for this infrastructure, without accountability and without dedicated funding, these projects won't necessarily be built. A reemphasis on building highways, and not even necessarily fixing existing infrastructure, but building new infrastructure, which is expensive, time consuming, can really wreak a lot of havoc to communities across the country. So really seeing a reemphasis on that as opposed to different mobility options, different transportation options. And then I want to flag, many of us heard over the last I guess year or so about Project 2025, which, covered a lot of topics, but did touch on active transportation and emphasize that walking and biking are not the federal role, which is something that you heard at the beginning of this presentation was something that we're seeing the U.S. Department of Transportation articulating. So that is something that we are really emphasizing in everything that we do, is that there is an incredibly important federal role in building and supporting this infrastructure. So with all of that, what have we been doing to make sure that this message is heard? So we have been developing and promoting policy proposals, which we can talk a little bit about. We have provided recommendations to relevant committees that are going to draft legislation, and that has been echoed by champions in Congress. We were pleased to see that submitted to committees. We've been engaging with local, state, and national allies to amplify our requests and amplify our recommendations. And we've begun holding meetings with members of Congress or staff in DC and also in district offices. So, this is a huge undertaking. Just to give us a little bit of a timeline here. So we are working backwards somewhat from when the next bill expires. But as we've said, we have heard a lot of signaling that there is interest in expediting the process. So what we are hearing from leadership is that now through fall and really through the end of the year, both chambers will be writing bills. We believe that in fall and winter that the House Transportation Committee will review and vote on bills. And they have even more recently expressed interest in having a bill on the floor to vote on by end of year. So I'll add that in as sort of another timeline piece. In this coming winter and early spring, the Senate, so the House's counterpart, will, we believe, release draft text and review legislation, vote on amendments. And then the counterpoint to this, which is really important to emphasize, is the pay for. So, we have all these wonderful policies, but how do you pay for it gets to be really tricky. And so we believe the House will be undertaking that this winter and early spring. And so, that'll be really where a lot of the rubber meets the road. And then we think spring to fall of next year, both chambers will vote and pass a bill before the expiration of the current law. So that is, as you can see, in not quite all caps, but bolded, very subject to change. As I said, beginning, this is an incredibly dynamic moment that we're in. But just wanted to give us a timeline of what we're looking at for the speed of this. And so the next 18 months are going to be critical for us to be loudly emphasizing the importance of this, because the other piece to this is Congress has a lot on its plate. They have to fund the government this fall. They have to navigate, additional requests from the White House to rescind further funds. They're going to be worried about re-election soon. So we need to uplift the importance of this and make sure that offices across the country are hearing from constituents about the importance of funding trails, walking, and biking. So a few other quick things here. Appropriations. So the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program, ATIP, hopefully you've heard about this from us. This is a new program, well, not so new, but a newish program which was created with the last transportation bill. So in 2021 was created. Creates large strategic grants to connect walking and biking routes to destinations. Initially, this was authorized but not funded at $200 million, and it requires annual appropriations. We have had one success story of getting funding in 2023, and that funding is for the most part in a review process, frozen being clawed back, all of those different terms. We are working diligently to get that funding released, and there's been instances in which it has been released. But interesting news was the House authorized $10 million in funding for ATIP. Somewhat surprisingly, we were excited to see that there was funding put towards ATIP. Somewhat, a little bit unexpectedly. However, this does not meet the need or the intention of the program. This is intended to give, $15 million grants for construction, and at least $1 million grants for planning. And so having $10 million, that's not even one construction grant. So, a bit of a mixed bag there with the recognition of the need for funding, but not sort of understanding the intention of large scale connectivity grants, and the need for that type of funding. So we're continuing to work on that. And then grant rescissions. We had a grant rescission in the One Big Beautiful Bill, which you all may have heard about. That was the large bill that passed Congress a couple weeks ago, I want to say. And amongst the many things that happened in that bill, one thing that was largely underreported, which is something we're going to talk about as a challenge, was $750 million in large grants for trails and active transportation. This was awarded in March of 2024, but the vast majority of the funding had not had grant agreements in place, so it was clawed back. And that $750 million was the single largest investment in trails in history. And this was a program dedicated to repairing harm caused by previous infrastructure. And we're frankly, we're appalled, we're distressed, we're really upset about this. It definitely sends a message of priorities in the future. And though we have congressional champions, they were not speaking up for this particular issue. So again, that comes back to the need to emphasize the importance of this at the state and local level for folks to hear from you about the importance of funding these projects. And we are elevating the impact of the specific projects that were cut and working with partners in Congress to determine alternative funding sourcing for these projects. So one, that we've been working really diligently on is in Jacksonville. I want to say $147 million grant was rescinded, and that's $147 million. So that's pretty large amount of funding, particularly in this area of transportation. And though that money was rescinded, we've seen support from both members of Congress to say that they want to find alternative funding for the project. So we're working on strategies to help fund these projects in spite of this really appalling move by Congress and the signals that it sends moving forward. So this is my last slide, and then I will hand things over to Brandi again. So movement building, within all of this, relationships are going to be key, whether they be grassroots or grass tops, as they say. So we have been working really intentionally about building relationships with Republican leaders. And thankfully, we have a lot of robust relationships with Republican and conservative leaders already, but doubling down on that, particularly thinking about geographic targeting based on committee roles. So there are two committees that are going to be drafting this legislation, one in the House, one in the Senate. And so, West Virginia, for example, is a place where we've done a lot of work over the years, but the chairwoman of the Senate's committee that's going to be drafting this legislation is the senior senator from West Virginia. And so with that in mind, we are working that much harder to build relationships in West Virginia, uplift those relationships, looking at state officials, local officials, economic development angles. In Utah, as another example, there's a new senator in Utah who we think could be really impactful, who's been a champion in the past of recreational trails. So really working to hone in on relationship building there. And cultivating messengers and partners who have that conservative influence, whether it be folks who are going to write letters to the editor, folks who are going to do direct advocacy, folks who are going to make phone calls to elected officials they know. There's a whole host of ways that we're looking to cultivate those folks. And then I'll just say that, on the grassroots side, we have a program, Change Makers for Trails, which some of you may have seen emails about or reference to, which is working with our grassroots members members to learn about advocacy, to become advocates, to message the importance of trails. And we've been successful in connecting them with having in-district meetings, and are going to be continuing those trainings this fall. So if you're interested, feel free to let us know. So Brandi, over to you.
Okay, on that positive and hopeful note, Jorge dropped in the chat an op-ed that we actually just placed today, in the spirit of lifting up what happened with the neighborhood access and equity grants, but also putting forward this idea and this notion that we remain pragmatically optimistic. And I think a lot of folks have heard us say that before, but there is such a groundswell of support and demand for trails, walking, and biking in every corner of the country, in blue states and in red states, from the least likely champions to those that have been championing this for 40 years. So we're seeing it everywhere. We know that the public wants it. We also know that in many conservative places, the trail infrastructure is the backbone of their economic development strategy. This photograph in this slide is from Alabama, and a senator there who has spearheaded their state trail plan. They did not have a state trail plan, and his impetus is really bringing the economic development opportunity of outdoor recreation, the quality of life opportunity of outdoor recreation and active transportation to Alabama's many small towns. It's a largely rural state, and it's a beautiful state, and he really understands that. And so thinking about how we shift the narrative in this moment, how we control the narrative in this moment so that we can really counter what might be perceived as pushback from all different levels, right? People might look at the rescission that was in the One Big Beautiful Bill and say, like, well, does this mean this is all going to go away? And our answer is absolutely not. There is so much demand, and our job right now is to lift that demand. Elle talked about the relationships that we're trying to build. We're also trying to work very proactively to lift up stories in those same places, in those same priority states where they have members of Congress or important leadership that will have an outsized role in making decisions about what comes next. Lifting up stories that make it clear that this is the federal role. We have a story coming out in our green issue actually in a couple of weeks where we have leadership and advocates from all across the country who are working on large-scale trail networks where the impetus for that trail network, there was a vision, but what really got it going was an infusion of federal dollars. Because, how do you get two states to work together? You bring in those dollars. How do you get, if the biggest barrier is a massive interchange, that's going to take federal dollars to do. And so getting all of these voices saying that and cheering us on in that way is going to be so important. And, we often, I think, when we're talking about how we lift up a message or a story, we're in our own spaces, we're in social media, we're in RTC's platforms. All of you are taking that and carrying that forward to people that you know. We're in really often impressive, I'd like to say, like the New York Times and other earned media, but we have to think a little bit differently about where we're going to carry some of these stories so that they hit those decision makers. We have to think about getting, into rural radio networks, into Fox and Friends, into some of these podcasts. And, when you look at the postmortem on the One Big Beautiful Bill, and you look at, some of the wins that happened, in fact, the saving of public lands, there was an enormous groundswell of support across the country to protect our public lands. And I think at one stage in the game, the members of Congress and the senators who were trying to push that through thought that it was going to be an easy thing to do. And because of the truly bipartisan nature, I think, of that pushback, and really organic, whether it was truly organic or it was perceived as organic, right? That really, I think, made the difference and gave members of Congress the backbone and the courage, right, to stand up and say, we're not going to let this happen. It gives us a model to follow, but it also gives us a really big challenge, because our issue is not nearly as easy to understand as they're going to close Yosemite, right? They're not going to close trails that exist now, but if we lose this battle, we won't have new trails being built. And so it's hard to organize around something that doesn't exist yet. It can be hard to organize around something that's really technical and complicated. how a national park gets built isn't really what was at question. It's that they're going to take them away. How roads and trails and sidewalks get built, nobody really thinks too much about that. And we spend a lot of time educating. And I think our closest in folks, all of you, our membership, the real, trail and outdoor enthusiasts, they get it and they're willing to fight for it. But for us to be pervasive, and I think that's the core here, is that we've got to be persistent and pervasive. We need to kind of get to a place where these messages are coming from unlikely voices. Everyone expects us to have a story in Streets blog that says this is important, right? But they don't necessarily expect Senator Jones to do that. Next slide, please. So when we think about what are the roles here, right? RTC is setting the messaging. We're trying to set the tone. We're rallying the troops. We're doing the organizing. We're bringing people to the table. But when I look at this group and I look at the influence that you have, and I think about how advocacy takes shape, there's often times where we can call on you or we can call on our partners and say, hey, come to that meeting with us, that direct advocacy, right? We need somebody from the state or from this district. And I think oftentimes people will raise their hand and they'll say yes because, you really care. But thinking about that idea of persistent and pervasive, we also have to start thinking about advocacy in a more everyday context, thinking about advocacy as part of what we're choosing to share on social media, what we're choosing to talk about with our friends and family. When we go to a community meeting, are we asking questions publicly about the trail network? Or maybe we don't have a trail network in our community and we're asking questions about what we're doing to address safe walking and biking. Maybe there's a debate happening about, some safety issues or some economic development issues. Is there an opportunity to interject with trails as part of the solution and something that the community should be prioritizing? When things start to bubble up in a way like that is truly natural, truly happening all the way at the ground level, that is when I think that a lot of those elected leaders will start to go, oh, okay, like we expected to hear it over there, but now we're hearing it here and we're hearing it here and here. And then there was that article and then it was in the podcast. And then suddenly they start to say, we're going to really have to take this seriously because there's a level of kind of organized action happening here, or there's an organic collective action happening here that is either going to help us or, maybe cause challenges. Next slide, please. So some thoughts and some ideas about opportunities here for advocacy, think about, again, back to that community meeting. Can you take a position on an issue by bringing trails into the conversation? Is there a dialogue about safe walking and biking? Is there a dialogue about, we're thinking about a new business, district in the area, and or do we have safe walking and biking access to get there? Things like that nature. Think about how you're having these conversations with your friends, with your family, with your colleagues. We often talk about this movement as a big tent. We need people from all sectors here championing with us. We need the economic development sector with us. We need tourism with us. We need public health with us. We need education with us. We need all of those sectors saying this is what is the most essential investment that we need in our community. And we need it to be believable. Right. And so that's why from us, again, it's like what people expect us to say. But when we start to create that choir around that message, then things start to change. And we also want you to be thinking about the local, the state, the regional, and then ultimately also the federal decision makers that you might have relationships with or you might have access to, that are places where we could have these conversations, where we could really be talking deeply about the changes that are necessary or the challenges that we're up against. Next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about how that local directly affects federal, because often that is where we have our closest relationships or in the places that we live. So when we talk about, how these federal decisions are getting made, who's advocating, who's making an impact and having influence in their advocacy, those local and state voices carry an outsized amount of weight. So often our federal officials are looking to their mayors, to their council people, to, their regional leaders to understand what's important at the local level, to understand what the issues are that they're challenged with the most. I was recently in Alabama. I spent a bit of time this year in Alabama for different reasons. And I was at a tourism conference and a local city council person came up to me and she was thrilled to meet me and wanted to know if I had any money to help her pay for her trail project, which I said, sadly, I don't, but you can help us get more money. That is the goal. But she said, she went into office, and this is a highly conservative person. She went into office because because she wanted a trail built that was going to connect to an education complex, if I understand correctly. I think there was little kids and big kids, but that there was not even a sidewalk. There was no safe walking and biking, and you were just watching people walk with their kids, push their baby carriages up and down this really busy road. And she said, someone's going to get killed, and I don't want it to happen on my watch. And so thinking about her voice and thinking about her voice being carried to the governor, and then the governor carrying that story on up the chain, right? And that those are the voices, those are the stories that really carry influence. When we think about the next federal reauthorization, one of the most influential voices in that decision making are the state DOT heads, right? The members of Congress go to their state DOTs and say, what's your biggest problem? What's the thing that you want us to address? So we think about the relationships there. We think about how we can influence those relationships. And it's all sorts of ways, and again, persistence and pervasiveness. If we take one thing away from this, that is what we're going to need to do and how we're going to need to show up, celebrating all the progress, all the impact, all the time, thanking people, letting them know this is a great new investment. We closed this gap. It's a wonderful trail. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Creating experiences, inviting our local electeds and our local leaders to the trail with us. Hey, I love this trail. I ride it 15 times a month. I'd love to have you join me sometime. Actually have a meeting to talk about active transportation, or joining another meeting and bringing active transportation into the conversation, right? Because I think sometimes when there's an active transportation meeting, certain people show up, but when there's a meeting about, what we're doing about this new business district, lots of different people show up, and that can be a different forum to have that conversation. Think about how you amplify your story and the voice, that you're bringing to the table. Think about the local press. Think about letters to the editor. I have a few examples in here, but that has been happening more and more often, which is really interesting. And we're starting to see kind of a bubbling up of that kind of storytelling. And then just remember, social media is such a powerful tool in whatever forum that you're on, to be sharing both the things that you maybe are frustrated by, but also the things that you're excited about, because it reinforces the demand that exists. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pause here for a second and let everyone take a screenshot and maybe click on that QR code. So in the spirit of elected officials, we do have a pledge going on right now to ask our elected officials, our local electeds all across the country, to show their support for federal funding. Elle mentioned that part of the challenge we're up against is really ideological, and one that has been around and pops up almost in a cyclical nature of, is this actually the federal role, right? Is this a place where the federal government should be engaging? And we need local officials to be saying, absolutely, we cannot do this without that federal investment. I mean, we know that from the local perspective, some places don't even have the resources to generate the local match, right? These are real challenges that communities have. You're talking about, how do you maybe build this infrastructure in a town of a few hundred people, and they have to come up with a few $100,000 possibly for that match. So being able to get this voice in front of our federal officials is huge. Next slide, please. So I also want to talk a little bit about, we've got these general examples of what you can do, but how some of this has really happened in real life. And one of the stories that we love to tell is about the Active Transportation Infrastructure and Investment Program. That was a really kind of cornerstone piece of legislation that Rails to Trails Conservancy and our partners, both kind of in the nonprofit side and in the government side, championed to get into the last surface transportation bill, that provided large-scale grants for connecting active transportation infrastructures, thinking about those big projects that haven't been done yet, those connectivity projects that really help you start to be able to use this infrastructure for safe walking and biking routes. And that progress really came from knowing who the neighbor was of Senator Dan Sullivan in Alaska, and really talking with partners in Alaska, getting contact with that neighbor. And then he had dinner with Senator Sullivan and said, this is important to our state. This is why it's important to our state. And I really hope they were friends. I really hope that you'll champion this. And then Senator Sullivan became the Republican champion for the bill, and it was included. And so it's like those kinds of course, there's some organizing behind it, but it's those kinds of relationships and conversations that really make the difference. Next slide, please. So we have a couple of those here, and I'll just run through them quickly. One is our signature event, Celebrate Trails Day. It's never too early to put that on your calendar, always the fourth Saturday in April. This year it was April 26th. We had hundreds of events nationwide. And of note, and again, this is organic. This isn't us saying we want events in all these places. These are bubbling up from the community. There were over 100 events that took place in either districts that were really a priority to Rails to Trails or conservative congressional districts. And so it just shows that when we're kind of creating that moment for people to show up, they're showing up where they care about trails. And guess what? They care about trails in Republican places and in Democratic places and in places that are everywhere in between. And that is going to, when we put that call to action out, that is going to happen really naturally. Next slide, please. Another set of examples here just from local leaders showing up. And again, it can feel a little maybe out of reach, or, how do I make that phone call to say, hey, come on this ride? Will you just go on a bike ride with me? But I'm here to tell you that, in fact, it happens and they do show up. And it is a really good way, I think, to use our relationships. You might not know the mayor directly, but you might know staff, or you might know folks in city government and say, wouldn't it be great if we could make this happen? So we've got the mayor in Birmingham. We've got the mayor in Cleveland and the county executive for Cuyahoga County in Ohio. And we've got folks there, the mayor and council member and state senator in Tempe, Arizona. And just, again, showing the range across the country of the fact that this is important to these different communities, and their local leaders will show up. And can we get them engaged enough to then also get them to have that conversation at other levels of government on our behalf? Next slide, please. This is another example of one of those letters to the editor that I shared have been emerging, and just the power in that. And in this one, I pulled it in as an example because what I love about it is that she calls herself out as not necessarily a trail user. She says, I'm probably not going to use this trail. However, I really want it. And I really want it because it is good for our community. It's going to put our community on the map. It is good for quality of life. It's good for economic development. And that is just so powerful because, again, and what else is interesting is that, she's not a member. She found us. She used our data points, our talking points to make her case. But it's like, I'm not necessarily that person. I just know that it matters to making the place I live a great place to live. And so it's these kinds of voices, these kinds of stories, these unexpected, I think, angles on this issue that are what are going to keep lifting this up. And then RTC, we take this and then we use it. We put it to work, right? We bring it to meetings with us. We share it and we amplify it in all of our social networks. We make sure it gets even more legs nationally. So it's just so powerful. Next slide, please. We're going to quickly go through a little bit of messaging here. And I think, again, part of this persistent and pervasive call to action is that in the persistence, we also need to be consistent. And I think the most important thing we can be saying in all of the ways that it matters to us, or that it's really true and real in our life, is that this infrastructure is essential. This infrastructure is essential for the country because it delivers economic impact, because it delivers quality of life, because it is about making healthier, safer, more vibrant places to live. This isn't about politics. This isn't about, greenwashing. This isn't about any of the things that are out there. This is about ultimately having a great place to live and a strong economy and a healthy, population. And so being able to lean into the pieces of that matter the most to you is really the way to go in those conversations, but essential being the key there. And also thinking about just what's at stake. I think when we're in a moment like we're in now, even when you look back at the One Big Beautiful Bill and the challenges there was a lot happening. Right? This was less than $1 billion that was at stake in the context of billions and billions and billions of dollars that were being volleyed around. It is hard for people, I think, to wrap their head around the numbers. It's hard for people to wrap their head around how does this matter as much as maybe people losing healthcare or losing access to food or other things. And so we have to get really articulate about what we lose as a country, what we lose as a community if we are not able to make the progress that we're making now. So thinking thinking about the fact that the demand for this infrastructure is 40 to 1. In the last round of grant applications for ATIP, that was how out of sync it was, 40 to 1 in terms of requests. Keeping people safe. There are as many 20 people who die walking every single day. That is a really visceral statistic. I remember when they really were able to quantify the reach of mental health challenges in the country, and it was 1 in 5 Americans had a mental health challenge. And that was the moment when people started to look around their room and say, oh wow, okay, 5 people in this room are probably dealing with something that we don't know about. I feel like that about this number. 20 people dying while walking every day is really, really tangible. And thinking about the economy, for every dollar, this is a good investment. For every dollar that goes in, $1.72 comes out. that is pretty good in terms of the math. And so, and better often than other infrastructure investments. So depending on, again, where your heart and head are, and depending on what authentically really resonates with you, there are a lot of ways that we can bring to life, I think, both why this is essential and also what's at stake if we're not making progress. Next slide, please. And so why this matters now, we can breeze by this, but I think, Elle, you captured it all really well before, just in the urgency of this moment that we're in. We need to make sure that this is loud. We need to make sure that this is loud for a long time. So thinking about all the ways that we can roll this issue into our day-to-day, into the moments where we're in community, at community events, in community meetings, and how you can spend your time helping us with the direct advocacy. This is a long haul, and we're going to need all the support we can get. Next slide, please. So this is another one to take a moment on and use that QR code. So we are gathering folks who are willing to raise their hand and go to meetings with us or get more deeply involved. And we would love to have you there. You can also send Jorge or Jimmy or others on our team a note to get involved. But that is something we're actively trying to do. You're also welcome to take a picture of this and bring it with you places. If other people want to get involved, we want them. We want them in our circle so that we can put them to work. Next slide, please. And last but not least, another thing to take a picture of here is your action plan. So giving you just 5 things you can do in the downtime when we're off this call, thinking about advocating in the public view. Think about whether there's a letter to the editor in you, or you want to write an op-ed, or just simply share some of your experiences on social. Think about inviting some of your officials, people you might know, out onto the trail, but then not forgetting to share that it happened, because if it doesn't get shared, then nobody knows. Ask your local and state officials to sign the pledge. Engage agency contacts. Sometimes that's where our relationships are, thinking about the DOTs, the health folks, the tourism folks, et cetera. And then those meetings, that direct advocacy is really, really important as well. And we are right here to help you with that. And with that, I think we're going to go to discussions. I'm not sure if we have any questions yet. Jorge was going to help us to navigate those. And it was a lot. So thank you all for sticking with us on that. So we have a question from Kimberly. Hi, Kimberly. It's so nice to have you here, about whether we have state level champions listed for each state. So we have not publicly listed, but I think whether we were trying to pull together, we've got partners in every state who we engage in different ways as champions. In some states, we do have members of Congress that are our cheerleaders, and whether they're willing to speak at that moment or not at that moment is often a political calculus. But those people exist. We have local officials in most states. So depending on the state, and I think that would be an offline conversation to have about, what you're looking for there and how we can help you maybe make some connections and channel the energy in the right space. Elle, is there anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I would also say, in addition to champions, I think going back to sort of the decision makers, there's also states where we're really looking to grow. So it could be that there are people who are champions and we haven't had as much of a staff presence. So, I mentioned Utah earlier because there's 3 members of Congress on relevant committees. Utah passed state funding for trails. They are quickly becoming sort of a ruby red champion for promoting not just trails, but active transportation across the state. The DOT is supportive. MPOs are supportive. There's a lot of bipartisan support for this. We just haven't been there as much as other places, in part because there aren't abandoned railways, and for a variety of reasons, we've had staff presence elsewhere. And so if you are in Utah, other states, and you can help collaborate with us and help. We would love to help uplift some of those state champions as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Well, I don't see any more questions. I still see a bunch of you there. So we hope that we offered you some pragmatic optimism. That is the theme of right now. We are continuing to remain optimistic because we know the demand, we know the need, we know the champions that are there. But I think the reality is just becoming clearer and clearer about, we always know how much work it is to get one of these bills passed. But I think this is going to be an extremely different circumstance than one we've worked in before, and it's going to be noisier. It's going to require a lot more elbow grease, I'll say, to keep our issue top of mind. And being top of mind is what it will take for people to be willing in the halls of Congress to really act on our behalf. Elle, any last words?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, something I've been saying a lot lately is trails don't build themselves. They, require blood, sweat, and tears for people on the ground. And in a similar way, they don't just appear without funding, without the federal government having such an active role. And so, this bill and this future funding is going to be a different effort. It's going to take time. It's going to take dedication. But we are so grateful for your time and your enthusiasm and your partnership on this issue as we move forward. And we hope to see you soon at a wonderful industry
meeting
with everyone who likes legislation. We can pat ourselves on the back.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
We appreciate you, and we'd love to connect if you're interested in getting more involved. But either way, appreciate you being here and your continued support on this issue at this crucial moment.
Thank you all so much.